Hello out there. I welcome you once again today to our discussion on the Indigenous Hands, the Indigenous Voices, brought to you by Save the Deaf and Endangered Languages Initiative. Today we are going to be discussing the space structure of Indigenous African deaf communities. We are going to be looking at the structure of an average Indigenous African deaf community. So our topic is the space structure of Indigenous African deaf community. We will start by way of introducing what a deaf community is in an African setting. The discussion of any language is not complete without the detailed discussion of its users and owners, and that is why we are doing this study. We have been talking about the sign languages, the indigenous sign languages of Africa, and talking more of that and less of the deaf people who own sign language. But today we want to look at the community where these languages exist and how they are being structured. We tend to define an indigenous African sign language as the sign language used by indigenous African deaf and hearing people for communication, expression of thought, dissemination of information, and passing down of cultural heritage. This is our definition of an indigenous African sign language. The sign languages that are used by indigenous African deaf and hearing people for communication, expression of thought, dissemination of information, and passing down of cultural heritages. Arguably, many of these languages are not documented, and many of their deaf users have little or no formal education. That is one peculiar thing about an average indigenous African deaf community. The users, many of them are not educated in the Western education. And this stands as one of the distinctions between the indigenous and the urban or school sign languages in African setting. The social status of the users of these two languages. So remember, the indigenous African sign language is distinguished from the urban or school sign languages that we see in schools. Meanwhile, our discussion today is not necessarily, like I said, on the sign languages, but on the deaf community. What constitutes an average indigenous African deaf community? We have one type of indigenous African deaf community. One type, they are not two. And what is that one type? An indigenous African deaf community is that space consisting of deaf and hearing who use the complete communication system, that is, in bracket, signs, gestures, and speech in varied degrees of proficiency in their daily transaction. That is to say that an average indigenous deaf community is not made up of just deaf people alone, isolated in one corner of a city or a town, but is also made up of deaf people and hearing people, those who use different types of varied proficiency of signing and speech and gestures. Last week, we were talking about the roles that gesture play in signing in an average indigenous deaf community. So gestures being part of the sign language system. So that is why you see hearing people here. And one other thing that strikes us here is that an average deaf community is not made up of deaf people alone, means that they share the same space with hearing people. As much as we talk about stigmatization, we are not talking about isolation. So this type of community is different from the urban deaf community, comprising of the deaf schools and the associations of deaf people. This is different. All known accounts of an indigenous African deaf community suggest a spatial habitation occupied by deaf and hearing people, and with the mention of sign language as one of the, if not the main language of use. A spatial habitation occupied by deaf and hearing people using sign language at various levels of proficiency. In some of them, the sign language is the main language of communication. In others, sign language and spoken language might be used at varied levels of proficiency, serving the purpose of communication for the community. Let us see some instances of indigenous deaf communities. From as far back as 354 to 430 AD, Augustine the theologian describes in his text a space where signed communication was generously used between the deaf and hearing in Africa. A space where signed communication was generously used by both hearing and the deaf. This was as far back as 354 to 430 AD. And Miles, in his work, believes that this was probably the earliest evidence of a signing communication between deaf and hearing persons in a traditional African setting. Miles recorded a huge, copious and obvious amount of different documentations of that scholars and even non-scholars, travelers, tourists have made about African deaf communities and African sign languages, even when they were regarded not as sign languages, but signing communication or gesture or whatever it was called. So having this as back as 354 to 430 AD suggests to us that even what we are describing of an indigenous African deaf community today, it is not new, it is not foreign. It is indigenous, and it has been there historically. When we talk about the deaf community, though we could at some point think to the level of deaf isolation, but a lot of studies that we have seen and studied suggest that there has not been a good evidence of deaf isolation in African setting. But there could have been deaf stigmatization. They are two different things. All scholars that have studied the Damarobe deaf community have described it as a community of a high occurrence of deafness and a high interrelationship amongst deaf and hearing, resulting to a high proficiency of signing among deaf and hearing members of that community. If you notice, if you've been watching my series, you find out that I have almost always mentioned the Damarobe Sign Language and the Damarobe deaf community. And it is one example of a deaf community that has been in the historical trend about in Africa. And a Damarobe deaf community is a typical example we can always cite when we talk about a deaf community. Also, when we talk about indigenous sign languages, Adamarobe sign language, rather Adamarobe village, can be compared to the Martha's Vineyard of the United States, and both of which were existing around the same time in the 17th century. And we are using that village, that community as an example. And so all known studies that we have cited suggest that it is a community that is made up of both deaf and hearing, and there was a high level of integration. Our topic today suggests that an average indigenous African deaf community has deaf and hearing people occupying a space that is called a community. That's what we want to pass across today. This is in the way of preparing us to understand what an average deaf community of African setting is, and also preparing us to begin to think about what kind of communication was going on in these deaf communities, because some people have studied African deaf communities and African sign languages, indigenous, not the foreign-based African sign languages. I mean, the foreign ones that are in use in African countries, the indigenous. But we know that as much as have been studied, enough have not been studied. There's still a whole lot of information out there that have not been harnessed because of lack of scholars interested in this area of study. So the much we have done, we are very much aware that not many studies have described the indigenous African deaf communities from the perspective that we are coming to look at it in relation to how much the hearing people also have contributed, or do contribute in such deaf communities. But not as if the studies say anything in the contrary. No, much of the studies we have seen have supported the idea that hearing people are much around in deaf communities, and deaf communities are also much around among hearing people. Although there were accounts of social discrimination of deaf people, but not deaf isolation. Deaf children are often born by hearing parents among hearing siblings, and this has not changed. And that's why we have, a community that is formed this way. Till tomorrow, deaf children are being born among hearing people. In fact, our study continues to say that over 75% of, for instance, Nigerian deaf children are born by hearing families. They are born in amongst hearing siblings. And so if you have such number of percentage of deaf people among hearing people, you can imagine how much hearing people are in the lives of deaf people. But what has changed today? What has changed is the signing system of African deaf communities. That is as a result of the influence of foreign Western sign languages. And that is also what we keep pointing at in our series. The indigenous African sign languages have not attracted as much attention as the foreign sign languages. And unfortunately, foreign sign languages come to exist and are being used in African settings, influencing how much the indigenous sign languages are being used. Today, there's a whole lot of migration, linguistic migration, whereby indigenous signers are abandoning the indigenous sign languages, taking over to learn the foreign-based. One of the reasons for this is because of proliferation of schools, which is beautiful, which is great. So deaf people are going to school. Since the introduction of deaf education, deaf people are going to school. Having said that, remember that our topic is not trying to suggest that deaf people should not acquire education. No, our studies are trying to suggest that as much as deaf people acquire education, they should not abandon their cultural heritage. They should not abandon their linguistic heritage. They should not abandon their identity, who they are. And because of the fact that even in the international front, the much has been said and much is being done to preserve languages and cultures that are going extinct. This brings a whole lot of need and urgency for us to get involved in fighting to retain the cultural heritage of African deaf communities. The cultural heritage of not only deaf communities. If we look at it from today's discussion, we'll find out that hearing people are so much involved. So when we are preserving the cultural heritages of African deaf communities, we are as well preserving the cultural heritage of the hearing communities, because they share the same cultural heritage. So this is our study today, and this is what we want to pass across, giving a picture of an average African deaf community. It is going to propel us to looking at some other things that go on in these communities, having known what the community looks like. This might be different from any other community that we may have known, but the presence of deaf people in the lives of the hearing people and vice versa makes a whole lot of difference. Tells you how languages must have developed, tells you how gestures may have transposed into signing systems, established signing systems. Remember, we are on a journey to decolonize the communication system of indigenous African deaf communities, and by extension, indigenous African communities. And that is why we are engaged in the topics that we are discussing in the series here. And that is why we are involved in this crusade to preserve the cultural heritages of the African people, coming from the indigenous hands, the indigenous voices. So I thank you for sticking around today and watching this series. I'm going to see you again by next week. Before then, kindly activate notification while you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Remember, this is no other than the Indigenous Hands, the Indigenous Voices, brought to you by Save the Deaf and Endangered Languages Initiative. I'll see you next week. Bye.